Our speaker today is Professor Michael Kimmage, who specializes in the history of the Cold War, 20th century U.S. diplomatic and intellectual history, and the U.S.-Russian relations since 1991. From 2014 to 2016, he served on the Secretary's Policy Planning staff at the U.S. Department of State, where he held the Russia-Ukraine portfolio. Professor Kimmage serves as the director of the Kennan Institute of the Kennan Institute, which is now independent since the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars has closed. He is the author of 5 books, of which the most recent is Collisions: The Origins of the War in Ukraine and the New Global Instability, published by Oxford University Press, 2024. Professor Kimmage is a prolific commentator in forums about public policy and has written articles and reviews for the New York Times, the Washington Post, the New Republic, the Jewish Review of Books, and many other outlets. He has been a visiting professor at the Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich and at the Vilnius University in Lithuania. The title of today's talk is To End a War: A Historian's View of the War in Ukraine. Please welcome Professor Kimmage to the Mackinder Forum. With that, please begin.
Len, thank you so much for the warm welcome, and it's just a great pleasure to meet this cosmopolitan and learned group. And I hope I'll have something to add to your understanding of the enormously complicated issues that stand before the U.S. government and many other governments in trying to terminate what's a war that's now entering into its 5th year. And it's really my goal today in the next 40 minutes or so to sketch the scale of the challenge, and to do so first by going back into 20th century history. I'll start with the First World War, and I want to wind my way up to 2014 and then to 2022, and to provide something of a historical panorama or context for looking at the war in Ukraine. And then I would like to project that history onto a set of assessments of the last 12, 13 months of the Trump administration as it very consciously attempts to end the war. And my point is not to editorialize about the Trump administration, but to explain why I think by its own explicit standards, it's not achieved the peace that it was hoping for in the last 12 to 13 months. And so from there, I think we can go into a discussion of the relevant issues, whether the relevant issues are history and the past, or whether the relevant issues are up to the minute contemporary diplomacy. And I think that the problems or challenges that the U.S. faces are very similar to the problems and challenges that many governments face in thinking about the fraught subject of war termination. So let me begin with a bit of history. And I find it a very striking circumstance, evocative, in 2026, that 2 delegations went to Paris during the Treaty of Versailles, or as the negotiations were underway leading to the Treaty of Versailles in 1918, 1919. 2 delegations went to Versailles, and one returned with a nation. That was the Polish delegation. And then after the First World War, you do have an interwar Poland, which is very much a nation state, actor on the geopolitical stage, until 1939, when circumstances changed. But the other delegation was a Ukrainian delegation, and it returned from the discussions and meetings in Paris without a nation. There is a brief moment in 1918, 1919, when Ukraine is a independent political entity. I'll mention that Ukraine, prior to the First World War, was divided up between 2 great empires, the Habsburg Empire to the west and the Russian Empire to the east. Both of those empires collapsed in the midst of the First World War, so they're no longer setting the tone, determining the geopolitics of the region. And that's why you can get an independent Poland after the First World War, but Ukraine is not so fortunate. So after the First World War, what happens to Ukraine, and the word itself doesn't signify anything obvious in terms of politics or geopolitics. There's a medieval Ukrainian history, there's a Ukrainian people, there's a Ukrainian ethnicity, and a Ukrainian language, but that doesn't map onto any obvious or discrete piece of territory, which is part of the challenge that the Ukrainian negotiators faced at the Treaty of Versailles. But there is a interwar Poland, but there is not, in political terms, national terms, an interwar Ukraine. So what happens at the end of the First World War is that parts of Ukraine are absorbed into post-war interwar Poland. That would be the western portion of Ukraine today. And the other half of Ukraine, the eastern portions of the country, are absorbed into the Soviet Union, in both cases at the barrel of a gun. So it's violence and warfare that yields the carving up of Ukraine after the First World War. The first point that I would like to make by going into that contrast between these two delegations and who can determine in moral terms which was right, which was wrong. It's not a matter of justice that one delegation got a nation and the other didn't. It's a matter of politics and geography and history and circumstance. But by contrasting these two experiences, the experience of Ukraine and the experience of Poland, what I wish to suggest is that the unresolved nature of Ukraine's diplomatic status or geopolitical status circa 2026 is nothing new. It takes us back to a very old problem. And I think another way of putting the point, and another way of making the point, is that the Treaty of Versailles, which does resolve certain fundamental problems of Eastern and Central Europe, it grants nationhood to many different countries. There's a reason why one of the main train stations in the city of Prague today is named after Woodrow Wilson, and that's homage to what Wilson achieved for Czechoslovakia, interwar Czechoslovakia, at Versailles. But there are many, many problems and many, many issues that Versailles did not resolve. We could talk about this as a German question with Professor Xi and all of the things that the Treaty of Versailles did not resolve for Germany. I think that's a kind of well-known story, the German resentment and the reparations and how Hitler would exploit that to create a new kind of Germany in 1933. But it's very important for our purposes to note and to emphasize that Versailles does not resolve the problem of what Ukraine is as a nation and where Ukraine fits in Europe. In fact, Versailles completely ignores that issue, skates over it, and creates the conditions in a way for Ukraine to be swallowed up by interwar Poland and by the Soviet Union. So this failure to solve the problem is what to me is especially notable about the outcome of the First World War. It's a moment in time where Ukraine is not brought into the European fold. That story becomes so embedded in Europe, becomes so taken for granted by the late 1930s that there is a great sense of regret when Poland is divided up, at least by many observers, when Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union carve up Poland, Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact between 1939 and 1941, there's a kind of outcry and sadness about the loss and the disappearance of Poland. But by that point, for outside observers, not for Ukrainians, but for outside observers, it's almost taken as a given that there's not a thing called Ukraine. There's not a political entity called Ukraine on the map of Europe. And so the major development for Ukraine of the Second World War, to a degree, goes unnoticed by the outside world. And this is that the hybrid Ukraine of the interwar years, controlled by Poland from the west and the Soviet Union from the east, becomes a purely Soviet Ukraine after 1945. So the Red Army, of course, rolls across Ukraine. And those parts, I mean, I think most familiar to us might be the city of Lviv, which is in interwar Poland in the 20s and 30s and had been a part of the Habsburg Empire before then. The city of Lviv becomes a part of the Soviet Union, as does Western Ukraine after the Second World War. So, of course, this is a kind of solution to the problem of what is Ukraine and where is it going to fit in 1945, but it's a very brutal one. It involves, forced Russification and Sovietization, and it also involves the further disappearance of Ukraine from the political map of Europe. Now, there's a little bit, since I'm going to speak mostly today about U.S. policy, there's a little bit of resistance that comes from Washington in the form of a CIA program that supports a kind of Ukrainian national uprising in Western Ukraine, with considerable CIA involvement, sort of overlap between the work of liberating Ukraine from the Soviet Union and fighting the Cold War, but that's unsuccessful. There's partisan warfare in Western Ukraine, as there is in the Baltic republics, into the 50s, perhaps even into the early 60s. But that doesn't alter the big picture situation, which is that Ukraine has been fully absorbed into the Soviet Union, even in a way that Ukraine had not been absorbed into the Russian Empire before that. So, in a sense, the Soviet victory is complete in this regard. And if you follow historians like Serhii Plokhy, I think is the most distinguished, most famous historian of Ukraine living in the United States, professor at Harvard, and author of many, many books. What Professor Plochy observes about Ukraine in the 60s and 70s is that it becomes quite an organic part of the Soviet Union. And Russian language becomes increasingly prominent, sort of bigger efforts at Russification, again, Sovietization within Ukraine. And if you look at the leadership of the Soviet Union, you'll see that there are lots of connections to Ukraine. Mikhail Gorbachev has parentage and family. Raisa Gorbachev certainly lots of background in Ukraine. Leonid Brezhnev sort of stylizes himself as a Ukrainian. Nikita Khrushchev is not ethnic Ukrainian, but grows up very near Ukraine and has a lot of sympathy for Ukraine. So Ukraine becomes, in a way, a powerful, prominent part of the Soviet story in the 60s and 70s, and that might be how it would have remained if the crack-up of the Soviet Union had not come in 1991. Let me backtrack for a moment, and I want to make a point about U.S. policy during the Cold War, because I think it's quite relevant to what happens after the Cold War, and it may even be relevant today for how the U.S. looks at the region and approaches the broader region of Eastern and Central Europe. And this is that the United States, after 1945, takes what I would describe as a kind of three-tiered approach, or at least a two-tiered approach to Eastern and Central Europe. This happens piecemeal, haphazardly. I don't know if this is ever fully spelled out, but you can see this reflected in actions of the United States on the ground during the Cold War. So I mentioned a CIA, sort of effort to overturn Soviet rule in Ukraine. That fails. That's, an effort that's made, but it's not, you could say, a kind of deep effort. If you look at the classic countries of the Warsaw Pact, this would be East Germany, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, there's a lot of upset in the United States that these are under Soviet control. There's a debate within American policymakers, I think quite familiar to students of the Cold War, between advocates of containment, George Kennan's great idea of containment, which did acknowledge Soviet power in Eastern Central Europe as basically the status quo, and so-called rollback, sometimes associated with John Foster Dulles or Allen Dulles or other figures in the early Cold War who felt that Soviet power had to be challenged in places like Hungary. And when the Soviet Union invades Hungary in 1956, to suppress an anti-communist uprising there is a lot of anguish in Washington about not supporting Hungary. President Eisenhower had good reasons for not, using kinetic force in Hungary in 1946 on the U.S. side, but this doesn't go down well in Washington. There's a kind of internal confusion or discontent, and that's one layer of U.S. policy. Another layer of U.S. policy, which I'm quite fascinated by, just because I find it so evocative, is that the U.S. does not accept the annexation of the Baltic republics. So these are three republics, also, children of the Versailles Treaty, interwar republics with their own integrity and nationhood in the 20s and 30s. They become playthings between the Nazi Germany on the one side and Soviet Union on the other, and are, absorbed into the Soviet Union haphazardly in 1940, 1941. And then again in 1944, 1945, in the end phase of the Second World War. And Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia all become Soviet socialist republics in the 1940s. Stalin is sort of ruthless about how he brings this about, but the U.S. really refuses de jure to accept this. And the way to put this in kind of local Washington, D.C. terms is that the U.S. keeps the embassies of these three countries as property of an independent Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia for the duration of the Cold War. And when the Soviet Union falls apart, these embassies are then returned to the countries that the U.S. government considers to be their rightful owners. So it's not that the U.S. is able to contest Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia that are in the Soviet Union, but in an important way, the United States does not accept that. So that's a second layer of U.S. policy. You have this kind of dislike that the Warsaw Pact exists. Secondly, you have a refusal de jure to accept the annexation of the Baltic republics. But I want to contrast this to a third layer, which is Belarus and Ukraine, which are accepted basically as parts of the Soviet Empire, as parts of the Soviet Union. And this is not contested. There's no effort to keep an independent Ukrainian embassy. Of course, there isn't one in 1918 or 1919, but there's no effort to maintain these national units as necessarily independent from Russia or from the Soviet Union in the Cold War. And that's a distinction. It's a difference between the way that the U.S. government treats Ukraine and the way that the U.S. government treats the Baltic republics. If we had more time, we could go into the why of this. I think that there are reasons, and that has to do with patterns of immigration, and I think the way that the U.S. creates its own map of Europe, and we could get sidetracked into that. I just want to point out that this is sort of a fact of Cold War policy. Let me take the story forward a little bit in time, but I want to emphasize continuity between the fact that I just described, which is a multi-tiered policy of the United States toward Eastern and Central Europe. And I want to suggest that this fact that I've just described of different attitudes toward different ethnicities and regions remains salient, remains important after the fall of the Soviet Union. So, from a US perspective, we'll think here about the George Bush Sr. administration. Russia is considered the rightful, you know, inheritor of the Soviet mantle, not in a kind of moral sense, but in a practical and political sense. And so it's a very important agenda of the George Bush Sr. administration that nuclear weapons that had been distributed across the Soviet Union, especially Ukraine and Kazakhstan, that they become centralized in Russia. This made it easier to deal with the whole question of nuclear weapons, and all the arms control, the whole architecture of arms control worked out painstakingly over decades. The US wants that to carry over from the Soviet period to the post-Soviet period, and it wants Moscow to be at the center of that. So the U.S. does acknowledge, Russia as the sort of formal inheritor of the Soviet legacy in policy terms, especially on nuclear questions, to which we'll return in just a moment. The United States is very happy to see an independent Ukraine and an independent Belarus. We do have the Chicken Kiev speech of George Bush Sr., which was about going slow and not rapidly breaking up the Soviet Union. But in no way does the U.S. contest. In fact, the U.S. is sort of happy to see its Woodrow Wilson's vision being achieved, after all, in 1991, of a Europe that is determined by, as Wilson would have put it, ethnic self-determination. So if you have a Belarusian people and a Ukrainian people and a Russian people, it's legitimate and appropriate and good that you have a Belarus, a Ukraine, and a Russia. So in the eyes of U.S. policy, the emergence of these nation states is a good development, certainly much better than the U.S. considered the Soviet Union to be, and really all previous arrangements for Europe. Europe is coming into its own, according to U.S. policymakers in the 1990s, and great that there's a Belarus, a Ukraine, and a Russia. Even better that there are three Baltic republics. Remember, they get their embassies back. It's sort of normalcy has been achieved. This illegal annexation and occupation, 40-year occupation of the Baltic republics is over. These countries can be the democracies that they were always supposed to be in U.S. eyes. And even better than that, you have the countries of, becomes Czech Republic and Slovakia, Poland, Hungary, and unification of Germany. All of this is very, very attractive in U.S. eyes as, the inclination toward democracy, integration, peace in Europe, and a moving beyond of the Cold War, and a moving past the Soviet past. But it is not the case that the U.S. is entirely equal in the way that it sees all these different countries. And here's where I think the fact that I described a moment ago is salient for the post-Cold War period. So it is taken as a given on the U.S. side that Russia will not join NATO, although there are debates about that, and there's a paper put forward in the old office that I used to work in, Office of Policy Planning. There's a 2002 paper proposing that Russia join the NATO alliance. So it was not unthinkable for Washington, but it was not often thought about. Belarus and Ukraine as parts of NATO are basically understood to be non-starters, with an exception that I'll get into in a moment. And the other countries, the Baltic republics and the former Warsaw Pact countries, are candidates for joining the NATO alliance. In fact, it's Lech Walesa and Václav Havel who sort of agitate in the first Clinton term in the early 90s for the expansion of NATO. At first, the US actually doesn't like the idea, is resistant, and then it warms to the idea. And so you get two rounds of NATO expansion, more than two, but two main rounds of NATO expansion, where first in the 1990s, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, and other countries joined the NATO alliance. Germany has been, United Germany was ipso facto understood to be a member of NATO in the U.S. point of view. And then you get the Baltic republics a little bit later joining the NATO alliance as well. So this kind of maps on to the Cold War view that the United States had of the region, in which the Baltic republics and the Warsaw Pact countries were different from Belarus and Ukraine. And there's really no conversation. I'm not aware of a policy conversation ever about Belarus joining NATO. We spill a lot of ink talking about Ukraine and NATO, but Belarus and NATO has never been a real conversation. Russia and NATO, as I mentioned a moment ago, is a conversation that's never really gone anywhere. And Ukraine, of course, is quite complicated here. So let me catch up on just a little bit of history here in the 1990s in terms of Ukraine. I want to take the story up to 2008, and then take this part of the history all the way up until 2022. And I do want to conclude with a few thoughts about the Trump administration and where it's going to do its work in terms of these longstanding and old and indeed quite unresolved questions. In the 1990s, there is consensus in Washington across administrations, Republican and Democrat, Bush Sr. and Clinton administrations. There is consensus that there is one overridingly important issue with Ukraine, and it is not geopolitics in the sense of joining NATO. It's getting Ukraine to return or give up or transfer its nuclear weapons to Russia. That is the overriding concern. The United States didn't want nuclear weapons to fall into the hands of rogue actors or to be sold on some kind of open market or to contribute to a logic of nuclear proliferation. That's what the United States wanted to avoid. I think most European countries thought very similarly in the 1990s. And so pressure is exerted on Ukraine to take the nuclear weapons that it has, that were on Ukrainian soil when Ukraine became independent in 1991, and to give those weapons to Russia. That happens. Uh, and in return, Ukraine receives something called the Budapest Memorandum, which was a set of security guarantees from Europe, from the United States, and from Russia that Ukraine had given up its sort of wasn't quite a nuclear program, that would be the wrong description, but had given up its nuclear assets, and in return, Ukraine was going to get its security guaranteed by various actors. One can't, of course, look back at this in anything other than the spirit of what would it be now? Wistfulness, irony, despair, outrage, in terms of where all of this would go later on. But that was the understanding in the 1990s that Ukraine didn't really have an enemy. I think that was the assumption. This was helpful. It was a good development for nuclear arms control and for nuclear nonproliferation and not damaging to Ukraine. And there were certain sweeteners that were offered to Ukraine in terms of trade and commerce that were a reward for what Ukraine had done with its nuclear weapons. But there is not a deep conversation in the 1990s about having Ukraine join the NATO alliance. And in fact, if you look at public opinion polls in Ukraine itself, it's not as if the majority of Ukrainians were eager to rush into NATO. That is a change that happens gradually over time in Ukraine, but it's not that there's a groundswell of support for the NATO alliance in Ukraine in the 1990s. Uh, there's a lot of history, of course, that matters between the 1990s and 2014. I'll skip over that because, we need to get to to the heart of the matter, which is 2014 and 2022. What is very striking about 2014 and 2015, or 2013, 2014, 2015, this is the revolution in Ukraine, Maidan Revolution, Revolution of Dignity in Ukraine, Russian annexation of Crimea, Russian incursion into eastern Ukraine, or the Donbass, is that a lot of what had been unresolved for more than a century remains unresolved in 2013, 2014, 2015. Although the situation is much dramatized by what happens in Ukraine, the transfer of power from one government to another within Ukraine, annexation of Crimea, a Russian invasion of Ukraine, there's no other word for it, in 2014. It doesn't change the fundamental equation, which is that Ukraine is not a part of the European club in 2013, 2014. The revolution in Ukraine, and in complicated ways, it is instigated, it's sort of sparked by questions of Ukraine's connection to the European Union, because, of course, it's the Eastern Partnership Program of 2009, which extended a hand to Ukraine, not about membership, but about legal arrangements. And then Ukraine's president in 2013, Viktor Yanukovych, has the decision before him of whether to sign or not to sign an association agreement with the European Union. When he chooses not to sign, with a lot of pressure from Moscow, that generates a revolution in Kiev and in ultimate other cities of Ukraine and across the Ukrainian nation. And that becomes the Maidan Revolution of 2013, 2014. So this is a story bound up very much in Ukraine's place in Europe, but it was not about as if Ukraine was about to join the club in 2013. It was taking a step toward Europe, but it was not about to take a step into Europe in 2013. In 2014, and here I feel like I have, personal experience of this because I worked in the State Department in these years and can at least state with clarity what U.S. policy was and what the policy of the U.S.'s European allies was in 2014. there was not a push to bring Ukraine into NATO in 2014. This had been promised at a NATO summit in 2008, Bucharest NATO summit by George W. Bush, in a kind of last minute, very sloppy, very chaotic way, actually as a way of not giving Ukraine a membership action plan in 2008. That was the real reason. And so rhetorically, a kind of gift was given to Ukraine that one day, in the language of the NATO statement in 2008, remarkably, Putin was in presence, sort of in physical attendance at that particular summit, and the promise was made that one day Ukraine would join the NATO alliance. So that's a general promise for the future. In 2014, Washington, Berlin, London, Paris, and Brussels do not say that the obvious answer to Russia's annexation of Crimea and Russia's invasion of eastern Ukraine, the obvious answer is that Ukraine has to be brought into NATO. That is not the conclusion drawn in Western capitals. It's a much more modest conclusion that's drawn, which is that economic statecraft should be used to push the Russian soldiers out of eastern Ukraine, at least. I think Crimea was tacitly conceded to Russia in 2014, not happily. That was not a development that anybody wanted outside of Russia, but it was not one that anyone was really going to contest, certainly not through military force. And even through economic statecraft, but the Russian military presence in eastern Ukraine was supposed to be eliminated through economic statecraft in the form of sanctions. But that's very different from bringing Ukraine into the basic security structures of the transatlantic alliance. That was not seriously proposed in 2014. If anything, that becomes more complicated. It's hard to bring or impossible to bring a new country into NATO if it has border problems. That's sort of a practical difficulty. But I think the larger difficulty was that there was a lot of fear of what Russia was going to do and of what Russia could do. And so to deal with questions of Ukraine and NATO was not the right time. Angela Merkel said that there is no military solution to the crisis in Ukraine in 2014. So meaning that this has to be done through negotiation and through economic pressure, but Ukraine is not by force going to be brought into NATO or into Western security structures. And in a way, Ukraine was left hanging. And what I want you to conclude when I say Ukraine was left hanging is that this is really Ukraine's story in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And of course, as I began, Ukraine's story in Paris in 1919. It's left hanging. That just doesn't change in 2014, 2015. It may have changed in 2022, and it may have changed for Europe. You'll see now a language in most European capitals, not Budapest and not Bratislava, but most European capitals, where if not NATO membership, and that's of course seriously discussed across Europe now, if it's not NATO membership that's going to be there for Ukraine, it could well be EU membership. That is a process that's really been sped up after the Russian invasion in 2022. And one of the conversations of the hour, we can return to it if you have questions about it, is a conversation about security guarantees for Ukraine, which could well be the equivalent of NATO membership, sometimes through a coalition of the willing. That's one thing that's discussed at the present moment, or perhaps it would be Europe-wide, or perhaps, presumably after 2028, it could be a transatlantic set of security guarantees that are given to Ukraine that are the equivalent of NATO's Article 5 commitment, but not the same thing. So the conversation has really shifted in 2022. I don't know if the reality has shifted, but the conversation has really shifted after 2022, and Ukraine has come much closer to being a member of the European club. Part of that is, sort of legal and commercial. Ironically, the association agreement that Viktor Yanukovych refuses to sign in 2013 gets signed in 2015 by Petro Poroshenko, the next president of Ukraine. So, that's a battle that Putin loses in a way back then. And 2022, out of sympathy for the people of Ukraine, Europe has really understood that Ukrainians need some kind of membership in Europe, and also Europeans need to work on this question of where Ukraine fits. They can't let it hang and let it float free and just sort of let the chips fall where they may, because that's led to disaster multiple times. First, 2014, but then in a much more spectacular way in 2022. But my point is to talk here about the U.S. and U.S. policy. And so I want to conclude with just a few thoughts about where things have gone in the last 13 months, where the Trump administration has tried to take this. And I want to just sketch out what I feel are some of the core difficulties that the U.S. faces when it comes to ending the war in some kind of meaningful way. One can think of, cosmetic ways of ending the war where there could be a ceasefire for 2, 3 months and the war could return, but that's not what I have in mind. I want to think about comprehensive conclusions to this war, conclusions to the war that would prevent the outbreak of future invasions or the outbreak of future large-scale wars on Ukrainian territory. So this was a campaign theme for Donald Trump in 2024. And what candidate Trump did was to distinguish himself from President Biden and to say that there was going to be a different set of approaches if he were to be elected, and that the approach that President Trump would take was going to be framed much more around peace than around victory. That was the argument that was made on the campaign trail, a kind of critique of the Biden administration that it was talking about victory, winning in some way in Ukraine, but it wasn't able to do so. And so there was a need for a new approach in Washington. And rather than winning outright, whatever that might mean, a Trump administration, if elected, was going to work on ending the war. And of course, you have signature rhetorical flourishes from candidate Trump that this could be done in 24 hours, or could be done in very short order, or almost as if by magic the war would end if he were to be elected. But that, of course, was the campaign, and governing is always more complicated than that. So for the last 13 months, and this is ongoing as we speak in places like Abu Dhabi and elsewhere, the Trump administration has thrown itself into a furious, fast-paced, and high-profile effort to end the war. You've had pushes at times for a ceasefire. You've had a summit meeting between President Putin and President Trump. I think it was September of this past year, September 2025, in Anchorage, Alaska. You had a summit meeting between the two leaders. You've had very extensive working groups between the United States and Russia, United States, Russia, and Ukraine. That's what the United States is trying to do now, is to kind of establish a triangular format for diplomacy, U.S., Ukraine, Russia. You have the figure of Steve Witkoff. You have the figure of General Kellogg. These are envoys who have been empowered to work on the question of war termination. The United States, under President Trump, has not been shy at all about putting all kinds of pressure on Volodymyr Zelensky, Ukraine's president, to come to terms, to make concessions. And the United States has, I think, in less clear ways, used its leverage in Europe to try to push towards some kind of conclusion for the war. Certainly, it's the case. We'll see what Secretary Rubio's comments are in Munich next week about the war in Ukraine and about Europe and where the U.S. stands. You know, it's always a bit of a moving target with the Trump administration in terms of where the agenda is at any given moment. But we'll see how Secretary Rubio articulates this next week. But surely he will exert some kind of pressure on Europe and on Ukraine. President Zelensky is going to be at the Munich Security Conference. There will be U.S. pressure on Europe and Ukraine to end the war. So, you know, the U.S. is also willing. I'll make another point about the Trump administration in terms of how they've been different in approaching this from the Biden administration. I think that there has been a effort on the part of the Trump administration to serve as a quote unquote honest broker. That as opposed to the Biden administration, which was overtly pro-Ukraine and pro-Europe and Atlanticist, what the Trump administration has done is to withdraw support to a great degree from Ukraine. You know, not withdraw a lot from Europe, although that's ongoing, you know, not big troop reductions from Europe on the part of the US. And I wouldn't be surprised if, as in the first Trump term, military spending of the US vis-a-vis Europe goes up in the second term as opposed to going down. You know, nevertheless, the U.S. has pulled back in many ways. Obviously, transatlantic relationship has a very different feeling in the second Trump term than it does than it did under the Biden administration. And the U.S. is trying to treat, or has tried, occasionally tried to treat Russia with respect over the last 12, 13 months, right? The summit meeting is that. The kind of statements, the U.S. is very uncritical of President Putin, very uncritical of the war, at times has blamed Ukraine and NATO expansion for the war, adopting elements of the Kremlin narrative as to why the war took place in the first place. And I think the logic behind that is that if you offer Russia a certain degree of parity and respect, they'll come to the table and start to offer concessions. So you pressure Ukraine, you pressure Europe, you change the tone in the way that Russia is approached, and you hope for some kind of outcome that's going to lead to an end to the war. That's the best I can do to try to characterize the thinking behind the Trump administration approach over the last 12, 13 months. It is my assessment. I don't mean to editorialize here and be excessively subjective here, but it is my assessment that none of this has borne fruit. In other words, the war is not closer to ending in February of 2026 than it was in January of 2025 or January of 2024. And for evidence here, I think I would, point to statements coming from the Kremlin, which suggest that Russia is going to be waging a very long war with maximalist objectives. And of course, just look at what's happening on the ground in Ukraine over the course of the last couple of weeks and months. You have a systematic effort on the Russian part to deprive Ukraine of its energy infrastructure in the midst of a very cold winter. That to me doesn't look like, the war is winding down. And then, of course, you also have incremental gains, territorial gains on the Russian part on the ground over the last 12, 13 months. So I think objectively speaking, in military terms, Russia is pushing for advantage. That's not incompatible with diplomacy, but it is the story on the ground. Russia's pushing for advantage. And if anything, the war is intensifying. And I would draw your attention to recent articles in The Economist and elsewhere about sort of Russian attacks in Europe, not military attacks or invasions, but through subterfuge, through cutouts, through intelligence, that in some ways are bringing the war home to Europe as a way of Russia's way of punishing Europe for supporting Ukraine. So, if anything, the war is expanding, it's growing larger and growing more intense and not getting smaller and not coming any closer to a conclusion. So, I want to offer two final thoughts as to why this might be the case. And my hope is that the history I began with is relevant to these 2 points, to both of these 2 points. One, uh, first point is that U.S. leverage is a lot smaller in Europe in 2026 than it was in 1919 or in 1945. And this is not because the United States is in chronic decline or because the United States has become an enemy of Europe, but because the United States is now one of many powers in the world. You have many that have risen up together with the United States. Russia is a strong actor, investing lots of its GDP and in some ways outproducing Europe and the U.S. on artillery shells and drones and those kinds of things, which is not what I would have expected at the beginning of the war, but tells you something about the relative nature of at least U.S. military power. But it's also the case that Europe has become much more of an independent actor over the last couple of years, spurred in part by the 2022 invasion that Russia made, but also spurred by an increasingly difficult transatlantic relationship. Germany is on the verge of investing three-quarters of $1 trillion, euros, I can't remember which, in defense. Most European countries have rapidly and expansively increased their defense budget. And it is to me crystal clear that any conclusion to the war when it comes is going to be done more through Europe than through the United States. Europe is closer. It has more of a stake in this war. Public opinion is much more attuned to the war in Europe than it is in the United States. It's, after all, a European war. And the Trump administration has made certain decisions to sort of scale back support for Ukraine that, of course, diminish U.S. bargaining leverage. And so I think U.S. leverage when it comes to the war in Ukraine is moderate. It's not non-existent. U.S. is important. It has good convening power. The bully pulpit and the media attention that an American president can garner are second to none. And it is the case that the U.S. can stimulate diplomacy, but I don't think that the U.S. can control diplomacy when it comes to ending the war. And so I think the moderate leverage that the U.S. has, in a way, speaks for itself. Trump has been able to return negotiations to the agenda. That's, I think, what he's achieved in the last 12, 13 months. But how those negotiations take place, I think Europe and other countries, I would include Turkey and Europe in this case because it's a part of the NATO alliance, but other countries like China are also going to play a significant role in the negotiations. It's going to be the U.S. as one part of a big puzzle. It's not going to be the U.S. running the show. And I think we've just gotten a kind of good case study on why that's or how that's the case over the last 12, 13 months. And I think the Trump administration exaggerates how much power it has at its disposal in this particular case. Second and final point as to why negotiations haven't gone further is the scale of the problem. The scale of the problem is enormous. We're talking about a country, Ukraine, which is, in American terms, roughly the size of Texas. Population 40 million toward the beginning of the war. It's a bit different now in terms of the number of Ukrainians living in the territory of Ukraine, but a very large population. A country that's on the Black Sea that borders a number of NATO countries. Romania, Bulgaria are nearby. Hungary, Slovakia Poland, a country that borders Belarus, a country that has a huge border with Russia. I think any uh, moderately capable geopolitical interpretation of Europe puts Ukraine at the center of Europe. And that's why Ukraine was such a pivotal place in the First World War, the territory of Ukraine, and such a pivotal place in the Second World War. Second World War, when you think of Lebensraum in terms of what Hitler is talking about, what he means by Lebensraum is really the territory of Ukraine. So it's a pivotal part of Europe's geography, a pivotal part of Europe's geopolitics. It's a country that has its own agency. Europe has agency here. Obviously, Russia has quite a lot of agency as well. There are nuclear questions that swirl around the war in Ukraine. There are reasons why the war has gone on for 4 years. It is an immensely difficult problem to solve. I don't think that reconfiguring questions about the territory in Ukraine's east are going to do it. I think that you need to be, if there is to be a diplomatic solution to this war, it's going to have to be very ambitious. It's going to have to be comprehensive. It's going to have to think through the question of what the EU is, and the question of what NATO is, and the question of where Russia fits or doesn't fit, the question of where Belarus fits or doesn't fit, the question of Kaliningrad, and what place and role Kaliningrad has in the larger European architectures. These are questions that are on the scale of the questions that Woodrow Wilson and Lloyd George and George Clemenceau dealt with, to a degree capably, to a degree incapably back in 1919. How long was Wilson over in Paris? He was over for months in Paris, away from the White House, working feverishly on these enormously difficult questions. That's not been my impression with the Trump administration and the war in Ukraine. I think that they deal with it now and then. But there are other issues in the Western Hemisphere, in the Middle East, trade and commerce that I think are far higher on the agenda than the question of Ukraine. And I think that's not going to work. I'm not saying what the answer is. I'm simply saying if there's an answer, it's going to have to be front and center. It's going to have to be worked on very creatively, very comprehensively, and it's going to have to be big. It's not a question of small tweaks to territory. It's the biggest questions that have emerged from the end of the Cold War. And I just don't see anybody in Europe, in the United States at the moment, who's sort of capable of providing lasting and enduring answers to those questions, which leads us to the very tragic point, I feel, which is that the war is likely to continue. The civilian suffering and the military suffering in Ukraine is immense. These are 4 absolutely horrific years of war. So, in moral terms, we have to get as quickly as possible to the finish line. But in diplomatic terms, we're far from being there at the present moment. And it's on that note that I would want to conclude, Len, and very much welcome your thoughts and your questions.